Good morning to you, and grace and peace to you and your family as you begin a new day today. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1, 2, and 3 provide us a key to understanding the entire Bible. The rest of the Bible is really based on this passage. And so everything that takes place in just these three verses is necessary for us to understand. Because in order for us to understand the rest of the Bible and why it is the way it is, these verses give us the explanation. So before we even look at Genesis 12, we need to understand or remind ourselves that mankind sinned and fell from the what God had originally intended for us. And that sin took place when Adam and Eve disobeyed God. Their disobedience caused the entire mankind, everybody that came after them, to fall short of what God has already planned for us and designed for us. And as a result of that, mankind sinned and so missed God's plan and God's will for him. But God did not abandon his plan or his will for man. God restarted his plan with Abram, and he changed Abram's name to Abraham. But this is what God did. He didn't give up on his plan. He didn't give up on his program for mankind. He simply restarted it with working with a new family, and that was Abraham and his family. The rest of the Bible shows how God is working out that plan which he restarted with Abraham. In other words, to understand the Bible, we need to understand God's original plan and how he came to call Abram in order to work his plan through Abram. And that plan, that calling, and the whole purpose of God with respect to Abraham is given to us in Genesis chapter 12, beginning from verse 1, verse 2, and verse 3. And we also have that plan and that agreement with Abraham detailed a little more in Genesis chapter 15 and even chapter 16 and 17. But here in chapter 12, we have the beginning. And so, once again, in order to understand the Bible, the key to really gaining an insight into why the Bible is written the way it is really an understanding in Genesis chapter 12 from verse 1 to 1 3. And so this is what it says. Now the Lord had said to Abram, get thee out of thy country and from your kindred and from your father's house unto a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless you, and curse him that curse you. And in you shall all families of the earth be blessed. Now, in this passage here, God came to Abraham and basically restarted with Abraham the covenant that he originally made with Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve fell, God moved to work with Abraham to get his plan going. And in this passage, God essentially made a covenant with Abraham that had three components to it. And all these components had an unconditional covenant that God made with Abraham. God told Abraham to leave his family. And once he left his family in Ur of the Chaldees, everything else in this covenant, God will ensure that it takes place. Only once Abraham left, and he did, he left. The first part of the covenant, or the first part of this promise, God says, I will make of you a great nation. Or first of all, actually, he said, go from your country into a land that I will show you. So the first part of this promise is that God will put aside a land for Abram and eventually Abram's children. So the first part of this covenant is land. And that land had specific boundaries. God, in chapter 15 and even in chapter 17 of Genesis, God detailed the boundaries of the land. And the second part of this covenant, or the second part of this promise, is that God will make of Abraham a great nation, which means a people. And the people that came out of Abraham, which God chose, was the people of Israel. They were the ones who came out from Jacob, whose name was turned into Israel. And so, with that great people, that great nation, God intended to put them in the land that God was going to give to Abraham. So the land was important because that was part of this promise, part of this calling in Genesis 12. And the people also was important because that was part of this promise in Genesis 12. But the third thing is God says, and in you, this is verse 3, all families of the earth will be blessed. In other words, through Abraham, the families of the earth will be blessed, or that means salvation. God had intended, even way back then in Genesis 12, that salvation will come through Abraham to the entire world. The Messiah will come through Abraham, and even more specifically, come through the people of Israel, who are the descendants of Jacob, whose name was turned to Israel. And so in this passage here, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, 2, and 3, we have the plan and the program of God into how He is going to achieve what He always wanted for mankind. And again, His program or His strategy for achieving His will for mankind is giving to Abraham and Abraham's descendants a land and keeping that land for that people, making a great nation that would come out of Abraham, and eventually that nation ended up being Israel. And secondly, through Abraham, and more specifically through Israel, God will bring salvation through all the world so that all the world will be saved. When you understand this, you begin to realize that this is exactly what the rest of the Bible is about, what the entire Bible is about. The entire Old Testament is about the land of Israel, the physical land, and the people of Israel, and how God made covenant with the people of Israel, how He brought them out of Egypt, but then He put them in their land. And so the entire Old Testament was about that land when Israel had to face the enemies coming into the land, when Israel fought for the land, when Israel was exiled from the land, when Israel came back into the land. The focus, or one of the main focus of the Old Testament, is the land. Why? Because that was one of the components of God's promise and God's covenant with Abraham. Why was that a part of the covenant? Because that is one of the ways God will bring His will for mankind. And His will for mankind was always to have man as really to have relationship with man, where man would rule and dominate the earth. So we see the Old Testament, the main one of the main focus is land. Secondly, in the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, one of the main focus is the people of Israel. And repeatedly, God talked about His people Israel, His nation Israel, in whom He will put His name, and even um, talked about all the kings and everything that He will do. And even though Israel had sinned many times and He sent them into exile, God promised that He will bring back His people. And in Ezekiel, for example, in Ezekiel chapter 36, He says He will bring them back and sprinkle clean water on them, and they will be clean. And He will take out their stony heart and put a new heart of flesh. These are things that speak about the people of Israel. It's the people that God decided that He will work through, chose them to work through them. And so the entire Old Covenant, the entire Old Testament is focused on this component of the problem, the promise, the land of Israel and the people of Israel. But then the New Testament is focused basically on the salvation aspect, which is the third component of the promise. In you, all families of the earth will be blessed. And so the Old Covenant is focused on the first two components, and the second covenant, the New Testament, is primarily focused on the last component of this promise, which is the blessing or the salvation that comes to the entire all the families of the earth. And so, really and truly, what we have today as the Old and New Testament, the Old and New Covenant, is really the working out of these promises God made to Abraham. And therefore, when you understand the Bible in that context, you begin to see the big picture that God had in mind. God's focus is on the land of Israel, His focus is on the people of Israel, and His focus is on the salvation that will come to the entire world through Israel. Remember, Jesus was an Israeli, He came from Israel, and through Him, salvation came in all of the world, which is the fulfillment of this promise that God made to Abraham. And so here, once we understand this, Genesis chapter 12, and the call that God gave to Abraham, we begin to understand how the Bible, for the rest of the Bible, how it is structured and ordered. The rest of the Bible is really structured in God focusing on the land, the physical land, the people of Israel, and salvation. God has not stopped focusing on all these three elements because his will for mankind is not yet fully accomplished. Man is not fully saved and delivered as yet from sin and restored to our original position. So that means that God is still focusing on the physical land in Israel. He is still focusing on the people of Israel, and he is still focusing on salvation. And he is focused on all these things on the same way, at the same level. God has not put the land of Israel and the people of Israel to a secondary position and raised the church and salvation through the church to a higher position. No, he hasn't done that. All these three aspects are at the same level. However, God has different timing that he uses to work with them. At the present time, the focus of God is the salvation of mankind through Jesus Christ. And so the preaching of the gospel through the church. But even though that is his primary focus right now, it does not mean that he has put the land of Israel and the people of Israel at a secondary level or a secondary importance. No, the importance of, in the eyes of God, the people of Israel and the land of Israel are today just as important to him as the salvation that he wants all the families of the world to experience. To put it in a different way, God has not abandoned Israel. The church has not replaced Israel. And the possessions of the church, the material blessings of the church, has not replaced the physical land of Israel. God still has a focus on the land, and he has a plan for the land of Israel, and it will be accomplished. God still has a focus on the people of Israel and a plan for the people of Israel, and it will be accomplished. And God has a focus when it comes to salvation, and his will in salvation would be accomplished. When you read Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11, it shows us that. Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11 show us how God is working through the church right now, but he's also working through Israel and the land of Israel. And eventually, these two groups of people, the physical nation of Israel and the spiritual Israel, which is the church, will come together and it will accomplish God's plan. And so we need to keep this in mind. Genesis chapter 12 gives us the foundation and it shows us really the big picture of what the rest of the Bible is. The rest of the Bible is a focus on the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and the salvation that will come to the world through the people of Israel. And so I pray God's blessings on you. I pray God's favor on you and his anointing on you as you begin another day. And so take care.